Welcome to our episode with Sarah Collison. This is our part 3. We will look at the AT process, and this is after approval of AT. So with AT approval, it's always great when that happens, but what happens after we've gotten the equipment for the client? What is important to do to make sure it doesn't just sit in the corner, that it actually does get used?
Look, I think it's, again, managing expectations around the process from the very beginning with the client. I think a lot of people think we're there just to prescribe, but not actually follow through with the prescription. And so I always talk about this, same for home mods as well, actually, that prescription is one thing. The setup, the follow-up, the training is the second part of that process, and to ensure that actually it works as we intended it to, it's getting the functional outcome that we wanted, and that people know how to use it and know how to use it safely. So part of that initial process is about explaining that that's going to continue once the application's submitted and approved, is that we are then needing to be there for the delivery appointment to ensure that AT is set up correctly, that if people need to have transfer protocols developed, or if they need to have documents provided about how to use guides or things like that. It really depends on the circumstances and the situation of the client. And again, whether they're an experienced user of AT or whether this is new AT to them as well, in terms of if they need training or if their support staff or family members need training as well. So those are all things that should be identified as part of that assessment process from the beginning, to ensure that we've made it very clear around what will happen once it's approved, particularly around hours that might be needed for funding as well. And then that is something that's included in the AT report documents that go to the NDIS, what hours are needed in that second stage. And so you should be really clear about that in the report as well, to ensure that it's firstly funded by the NDIS, but obviously then picked up by the client when we do get approval, that we need to get back involved and re-engage in that side of the process.
And do you find that if the initial AT process with managing expectations, making sure the client understands why we're bringing in this piece of equipment, helps with it, I guess, that we're not getting that AT abandonment as well when we do that process correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of times that abandonment happens because either the assessment wasn't really thorough and it's actually not the right AT, or because there was no setup and training on how to actually use it. And so people didn't have the support that they needed to actually integrate that AT into their day-to-day life.
Yeah. And how would you support families or, I guess, caregivers who are feeling hesitant or overwhelmed with whatever equipment they're having now to use with this client, or support the client to use?
Yeah, I think it's about kind of, again, a lot of it needs to happen in that assessment phase. I think I'm probably pushing this home quite a lot, but, you have to be setting those expectations really clearly about what happens next. And, if you've done a really thorough assessment, you would have considered how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, where it's going to be used, and hopefully identified some of those issues so that you're already planning for that.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't come as a surprise to the family if you say, we're going to do a couple of training sessions, or we're going to do some sessions with the support staff out in the community, or whatever it might be, or we need to go to the school if it's in the case of a child using a new piece of equipment in the school environment, those types of things. Part of that happens in that trial phase as well, where we've identified, how does it integrate into day-to-day life? Are there other things we need to consider in terms of environmental modifications as well? So if all of that has been done early on, it's much easier to implement that once that AT is approved. Yeah. So it's about them working with families to look at where's the best place for this training to take place, when is the best time for it to happen, who needs to be involved, how do we train someone up who can then maybe train someone else up in the case of a large team of support staff, all of those type of factors.
Yeah. A question that I have actually gotten recently regarding AT that has been approved, and the client was part of the trial process, where the client's not using it correctly. So the example is where a client was prescribed a recliner chair with pressure relieving material on the seat, leg rest not being too long that the heels are offloaded.
Mm-hmm.
But this client didn't like the material, wanted to have it reupholstered, didn't wanted to extend the leg rest after it had been prescribed.
Mm-hmm.
So is that, is that you kind of strike that balance between choice and control, but also informed decision making for that client to understand the risks of using the equipment incorrectly? Or do you think you kind of go back to like the assessment was done incorrectly, that the client didn't understand why we were looking for these specific features?
Yeah, look, it's a hard thing. Like dignity of risk is such a big thing for a lot of people, and it's about how do we respect a person's choice around what risk they are prepared to take versus what risk we are prepared to take as the prescriber.
Yeah.
And I think that comes from having a really solid relationship with your client. If you've taken the time to develop rapport, to truly understand their needs, to truly understand their situation, it's about then respecting how they want things to happen, but in a way that still ensures that you are being responsible and following through with your duty of care as a clinician, but respecting their choice around the risk that they are happy to make. So I think that when those situations do occur, it's really important to have clear, open communication with the client and to ensure that you have really good documentation that goes alongside that. So if people are making decisions and you have informed them and educated and provided guidance, and they choose to defer from that guidance, or they choose to take up something that you have not recommended, that you have documented that really clearly. So if you've had that in, say, a phone conversation with someone, or if you've had a conversation at the assessment, that you would follow that in writing with an email that says, as per our discussion, we understand that you would like to do X, Y, and Z. As a clinician, that's not something I can recommend for reasons A, B, and C. However, I've explained what the potential consequences might be, or the unintended concerns, or whatever it might be, and understand that you've decided that you accept that risk. And so just making sure that that's all very clearly documented as well, so that if something was to go wrong, that it's clear about what your role was in that process and what you have advised or not advised by respecting that person's wishes.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense too. And I think, the documentation of that's very important.
Yes, yeah.
The other thing with, I guess, AT rule out is looking at maintenance, making sure, I guess that's also worked into the plan. And I have had cases where clients have, I guess, when I initially saw them, they might have had a product that had worked for them for maybe 2 years, but now they need something different.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess with the NDIS, it's not always easy to have a second item approved. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you have any advice on navigating, or if it's best to try and make that product work as best as you can until, it's been a bit of a longer period of time that they've had it?
Yeah. It's very much about what is foreseen and what is unforeseen. And none of us as AT prescribers have a crystal ball when it comes to people's AT needs. There are some things, however, that you could argue are probably foreseen. So, for example, if you have a client with a progressive, deteriorating neurological condition, that potentially in 6 to 12 months' time, they may no longer be able to use a Sarah Steady for transfers. They're probably going to be needing a hoist. And so that's where the NDIS would expect that some of that clinical reasoning around what's effective and beneficial and what's value for money might consider that and look at, do we hire an item, for example, instead of purchasing it? Or if we know that someone, for example, is likely to need a tilt and space commode in the near future, do you just get a tilt and space commode now rather than a standard commode? Because that's what the NDIS doesn't like. They don't like when things that are foreseen are not considered by AT prescribers. They don't want to spend $1,500 on a standard commode now, and then in 6 months' time have you asked for a $2,500 tilt and space commode. They would rather just fund the tilt and space commode now, right? You don't have to use the tilt, right? You could just use it as the standard commode right now. But at least then that is better value for money. And that's what the NDIS have a problem with. It's the value for money component, that they believe if something is foreseen or can be foreseen, it's the prescriber's responsibility to ensure that that occurs. So I've had a situation with the NDIS, for example, where I was asked to come and prescribe a shower trolley for an 8-year-old boy. And he already had a shower commode that had been prescribed 12 months earlier. Now, in that 12-month period since the first OT had seen him, he developed this pattern of dystonia that was really causing him quite a lot of discomfort when he was seated in the shower commode. And he'd gone on a period of respite, and he'd actually used a shower trolley in the bathroom there and was so much more comfortable. He wasn't crying out in pain. He wasn't writhing around in the chair. He was actually easier to shower for the caregivers. So that was something that was clearly unforeseen by the OT who'd prescribed the shower commode. He wasn't having those dystonic patterns when she assessed him. Now, when I submitted my AT application, even though I'd indicated that that was the case, the NDIS still came back and said, well, hang on, the other OT prescribed a commode and they said that this would be suitable for the foreseeable future. And so both of us actually had to prepare joint documentation to say, this was unforeseen. You need to understand that he didn't have this when the first OT observed and assessed him. He only had it after I observed and assessed him, which was 12 months later. And the expectation that a piece of AT is just going to be suitable all the time, regardless of any change in function, is a flawed reasoning to have. And so we actually had to explain that to the NDIS, that this was unforeseen. There was no way that the first OT was ever going to know that this was going to happen for this client. But because it's now happened, we have to respond with a different AT solution. This solution no longer fits. And it required a bit more explanation to them. Unfortunately, they just didn't get it. But that was us then helping connect those pieces of the puzzle for them to understand, okay, this is why it's needed. So they were happy to then approve that once we'd kind of explained that in a bit more detail. But their initial reaction was, but you said this would be okay. And so it's about explaining to them that sometimes things are simply unforeseen. But where something is foreseen, and that's where that is their responsibility of the AT prescriber, if you know that something is likely to happen, you really do need to consider that in your prescription. And like you mentioned at the start, it might then be looking at, well, can we adapt what they've got? Can we adapt the current wheelchair? Can we make changes to the backrest? Can we retrofit, seat elevation or extendable leg rest if that's something that's now needed? Because again, the NDIS would prefer to do that rather than funding a whole new piece of AT straight away. So if we are able to repurpose the AT, that is certainly a much preferred option by the NDIS.
Yeah.
Until we get to a point where we can't keep tweaking it to accommodate the person's functional needs. And if we get to that point, we then need to obviously explain why this is now something that was unforeseen, that we got to this point, and why we now need a different AT solution to fit that functional need. So it's different to if you have prescribed something for someone's level of function, and 3 months after using it, they go, actually, this isn't working, and there's been no functional change. That might be an issue where actually there was something not right about that AT in the first place. Maybe we didn't do a good trial. Maybe we didn't really assess it. But again, you wouldn't just jump to let's replace it. You still want to look at, can we repurpose this? Can we make changes? Can we fix it in some way to make it suitable now? Or what do we need to do? So we actually had an example of this with a client. We had a client who needed a shower commode, and we had trialed a number of commodes, and it seemed like a fairly straightforward prescription. And obviously when you're trialing, you are limited in how long you can spend with people for trials. And what we discovered after it was approved and funded and it was delivered, we got a call from the group home saying they're having problems. The commode seat keeps detaching and sticking to the client's bottom. And we're like, what is going on here? And so the OT went back out. And what we discovered was that the client actually had this habit of sitting on the commode over the toilet for quite extended periods of time. And for whatever reason, what was happening was the seat was sticking to her. And so then when they tried to get it off, the seat was lifting off the base of the commode. Now, that wasn't something we could uncover in a 5-minute trial. You know, in the trial, we were simply looking at, is she comfortable in the seat? Does it go over the toilet? Does it fit the space? Yes, ticks all those boxes. But we didn't sit her on it for an hour to see if it was sticking to her when she tried to be transferred. So then we had to try and look at, okay, well, how do we try and prevent this? Do we put something over the seat itself? Can we change the surface? Can we, at one point, we were cable tying the seat to the base. Can we Velcro? We had all these different things that we were troubleshooting and none of them worked. We tried saying, can we change the routine in some way? So she's not sitting for so long, but that wasn't what the client wanted either. So we actually did have to prescribe a different commode to address the problem because we couldn't just change the surface of the seat. And the NDIS actually approved it, which was amazing. So we explained very clearly all the things we tried to do to troubleshoot and to repurpose this AT item. We'd explained why this was something that was unforeseen in that process. And then what we had done to try and ensure that this next piece of AT was absolutely going to be correct for the person. And we had been able to get an AT supplier that was actually happy to leave it for a higher period, which meant we could actually test it and make sure it wasn't going to have this same issue, which it didn't. And yeah, the NDIS then approved it. But it was still a very stressful process to go through of, you know, what happens if they say no? Because mum of the client was very adamant, this is your mistake, this is your fault. And so the OT had to do a fair amount of work to kind of look at, right, well, how will we address that if the answer comes back as no? Yeah. And that's something that can be a very hard conversation to have. So because a lot of people, and even the NDIS at some occasions, will expect that the prescriber is responsible, and so they need to pay for replacing it. So,
yeah, that's quite scary actually if you're working in the AT space to have that fear that you might need to pay for an item. So, I can definitely see the benefit of having like extended trials. Even I think some AT companies do. It's like a hire to buy.
Yes, yeah.
But like I said, that's not something you could have imagined being an issue. That
yes,
you have to have someone on a commode for an hour.
Yeah, exactly. So, and sometimes those things are they're just unforeseen. And that's what you then need to be able to explain and give that insight to the NDIA about.
Yeah. Thank you. I will go on to our next part, which will be, what do we do after AT is rejected?
Okay.